It's
Maybe.
redirecting. I think we're live. Yes, we're live. And so
Oh,
we're gonna press one more button. Hang on, hang on.
okay.
Now we're live.
Now we're live, live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Folk Music Educator podcast. My name is Phil Kramer.
And I'm Erin May Lewis, and this is a podcast where we talk about teaching folk music on the internet.
It's great. And for folks who may be still tuning in and watching the live stream version of the podcast, they might be going, wait, this is Tuesday. This isn't Friday. What gives? Well, I may have double booked myself accidentally, so we're doing it early this week.
And maybe on Tuesdays for the month of February, because next week I'm booked on Friday, and we'll just see.
Yeah, exactly. So, for a little peek behind the curtain, usually one of the ways the format that we've kind of figured out that works best for us is like on Tuesday, we get together and have coffee and just chat and figure out what's going on in our lives. And that usually kind of gives us a good idea of what we should talk about on Friday. And even if we don't have the exact same conversation, we have something similar enough.
It
And
gives us a thread to start from anyway.
exactly.
So we're
However,
still having coffee.
we're still
We're
having
not
coffee.
having a pre-conversation conversation.
Exactly. And when I brought this up to Erin last night, she's like, "Do you have any ideas?" And I did, but I wanted to kind of surprise her. I don't know about you, Erin. Do you, with part of your ADHD, HDMI, neurospicy brain, do you sometimes have a bad impulse control when it comes to getting new little gadgets or new little hobbies or things in your life? Or you kind of like, oh no, I didn't get bit by that bug?
Yeah, that's not mine. My husband has that one though.
Does he?
Yeah. And I have the one that's like decision impairment where I like look at the pros and cons list for so long that I can never figure out like how to actually choose a thing I need. So I will go for way past the point of like needing the thing before I finally do it. And then I'm
But
like, it didn't matter. Like option A or B would have both served the need I had, and I should have just chosen one. So that's my particular version. But I'm familiar with this other one because I live with it.
I go back and forth because there are times in my life where I will put off getting a thing that I need for years. I need to make the investment on a good violin bow, and I haven't done it for years because a good violin bow will cost more than my car, and I don't want to do it. But that being said, one of the I do tend to like little gadgets and things to explore my little digital minimalism lifestyle, always trying to find vintage gear or different things.
Mhm.
And one thing in particular that I have been really interested in is getting my reading better and investing in a little e-reader. And I started falling in love with this idea back in October, and I made myself promise because I did the whole fun window shopping thing of finding exact make and models that I'm looking at and which company I liked. But then I told myself, I'm like, it's very possible that ADHD brain is just doing it, like just hyper fixating on this new little gadget.
Uh-huh.
So I
Uh-huh.
set a timer in my life that on this was October 15th. If I still wanted one by February 1st, I could go ahead and buy it. And February 1st, my little ding e-reader, and I was like, yes, e-reader. And so I bought one. It
Aww.
hasn't arrived yet, but my little case has arrived, and it's very cool. It's very
Aww.
excited. But it just I'm excited because I have really started to fall in love with reading again and really starting to embrace the library lifestyle and all these
I know you
things.
you are an avid reader, I think. You're always talking about a new book.
I'm trying, and I'm trying to get to the point where it's my default thing. It's not the I should do this, okay, but just like, oh, I instead of pulling out my phone while waiting in line for
Mhm.
coffee, I pull out an e-reader, and so that's my
Mhm.
hope. But that got me kind of thinking because one thing that I find really cool about hanging out with you is that when I chat with other musicians that more come out of the world of academia, um, they tend to have a lot of books and resources that they like. And like, oh, I have all these etude books, I have
Mhm.
these theory books. Jazz musicians have all these great different theory resources. But when I chat with a lot of bluegrass musicians or old time musicians, those resources don't tend to show up
Yeah.
nearly as much. They're like, nah, you don't need that stuff. Like, just. But you are also like me, it seems. If I remember correctly, you're like, I think I might need to buy another suitcase to bring back all the books that you got when you were in Scotland.
Yep. Yes, that is a thing for me. 100%. Yes. I do love my tune collection books and the books that like talk about the like history and culture of a place and like I last winter I started reading Jean Ritchie's Singing Family of the Cumberlands book, and I haven't finished it, but like I just like found it again. You know, I have this
Yeah.
I have this habit of reading multiple books simultaneously and just socking them in various places in the house in an attempt to be like, when I'm in this room, I'll read this book, and then because the whole like I have to go find my book, it is a whole thing. So I'm like, well, I'll just put a book everywhere. So I refound the place where I had hidden my Jean Ritchie book for myself.
Like a little squirrel, like a
It's so true. But I
bibliophile
loved
squirrel.
reading that book because it would include these snippets of songs.
Yeah.
And I would be like, "Oh, I know this song," you know, like or I'd go listen to a recording of it or something. But then it would also tell the story of like which family member brought it to them or where they found this song or like we usually sang this song around this season and these are other things that we did around this season, like this was the song we used when we were gathering the firewood, or this was the song we sang when these particular relatives came over, and these were the stories that were the most popular to tell around the fire when those family members came, and it usually led into these songs. And there's something magical about that, like connection of music and culture in the storytelling and things that, yeah, I gravitate to. And to the music theory books, not gonna lie. You mentioned like all the music theory things, and I'm like, yes, give me more about understanding the brain of the musician. Sign
Exactly.
me up for
And
this.
so that is something that I thought would be a very fun thing to pick your brain about and give folks who listen because I have no idea. Maybe everyone who listens is like, I'm not a folk music educator, but I like Phil and Erin, so we're here. Or maybe you are and you do have a lot of books, or maybe you are and you're like, I have never once opened up this, and I tell people to avoid fake books like the plague. And so, just wherever you're coming from, to kind of see how we interact, our thought processes, and some of our favorites. And so, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Is there so coming from the dulcimer space,
Hmm.
is there a book that is well known in your space that you maybe really like that maybe not that isn't there's two ways we can go about this question.
Hmm.
One, is there a singular book that is kind of known in the dulcimer space, like, oh, if you play the dulcimer you more than likely have this one?
So I would say that there are a couple that kind of are in the same category of the books that most people end up definitely getting, and they are the like jam along books. So they're kind of mountain dulcimer equivalent of like the Fiddler's Fake book, where they're
Yeah.
just like kind of the basic versions of these tunes. And that they are the Join the Jam by Steven Seifert and like another thing that's almost that like by Dave Haas. So there's two people and they
Yeah.
each have like 100 tunes in them and many of the tunes overlap, but each of them has like a different kind of geographical or like they're separated by maybe 10 or 15 years and when they were published. And so
Yeah.
just to, I don't know if you've observed this, but there are definitely tunes that cycle through in
Yeah.
popularity, right? Like there are some that are really, really popular and you're hearing them at every single jam. And then, like 10 years later, you realize, I haven't heard that tune in a really long time. I think, like, when I was a kid, it was Blackberry Blossom. I mean, everyone was playing Blackberry Blossom. And now, when I think about, like, when was the last time I heard Blackberry Blossom?
Mm-hmm.
I can't even remember because it just went out of the rotation and it'll probably come back around again. Like I don't think the tune is dead. I just think it got tired and worn out
Yeah.
a little. And then it'll rotate back through because everybody will be like, "Oh yeah, I suck at it again. Like I need to go practice some more." And they'll want to play it some more. But
Yep.
um yeah, so anyway, those are the two um kind of like fake book style tunes that exist. There are also two method books that seem to be the ones that I hear the most about, and they are both written by women, which is kind of fun and
Hey,
exciting.
that is
Um,
exciting.
Bonnie Carroll's book is Dust Off That Dulcimer and Dance, which was published in the 80s, I think. And it was one of the first Dulcimer books I got. And I'm like looking over here because it's just out of reach on my shelf, but it's full of these beautiful pictures of Dulcimer gatherings. And as a kid who did not know that there was a Dulcimer community or Dulcimer
Yeah.
gatherings or festivals of any kind, I remember flipping through that book in the late 90s, early 2000s, and wistfully thinking, I wish I was alive when all of these gatherings were happening,
Yep.
only to find out that they still were happening. It was just kind of this like more underground thing that's not as well known or highly publicized as some of the other like big music festival things happening in the world.
I
Um,
like that a lot.
and then there's a current one by Carol Walker that it um it uses like a lot of kids songs because her strategy is like find the music that you've known the longest and learn to play that first. And so the Bonnie Carroll book is more like a traditional strategy of playing the dulcimer where there are different tunings that you go through more quickly and you learn kind of about like the modal music and
Yeah.
scales and patterns and there's a lot of like campfire folk song kind of music in that one, and
Yeah.
then the other one is more like kind of the nursery rhyme folk songs a lot to get you started with music you've known the longest. So
It's funny, that's a term in the classical music world that t- kind of got coined by Suzuki, the mother tongue
mm,
idea, which
hmm,
is a
right,
folk
which is
music.
why Twinkle Twinkle Little Star is the first tune in the Suzuki book.
Oh yeah, and why it's so helpful. And I think for a
Yeah.
lot of folk musicians, it's one of those things that um a lot of folks, like, I remember hearing a lot of people say, "Oh, the first tune that I teach folks is like Angeline the Baker," and my brain goes, "Why? That's so hard." And they go,
It's way
"No,
too hard.
what? No, it's not. It's like three fingers." I'm like, "Yeah, but there's like a call and response, and then a different thing, and then a different thing. You need to have like four different little themes in your head before you go.
And
It's
it's
all
got
this.
dotted rhythms
It's
and yeah.
there's all this stuff that your brain is just like, I don't know how to approach this while you're also
Mhm.
trying to hold an instrument in your hand
Mhm.
versus like, oh, I have heard Mary Had a Little Lamb poorly since I was a kid, and Twinkle Twinkle and all those things. And then my first go to act, like, that's not Twinkle Twinkle, Camptown Races, or any of that stuff, is Cripple Creek. Just purely for the fact that it's a
Mm-hmm.
call and response, um, and at least on mandolin and violin, it's you can play it on two sets of strings and then move it around. So you can play in the key of A, D, and G right
Nice.
at first, and then I
Yeah.
have them move it around and keys and practice thinking in shapes right off the bat, which is super great.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, that's a good one.
anyways, yeah, yeah. One of the reasons I bring this up is I was so glad that you brought up Fiddler's Fake Book, because that is a perfect example of a book that is everywhere in the bluegrass, like definitely fiddle community, and by and large you'll see in other spaces too.
Well,
Um,
yeah, because there is a mandolin tab version of the
mhm,
Fiddler's Fake Book, but then almost all of the other instruments just buy the Fiddler's Fake Book and then try to figure out how to decipher the notations and make their
exactly,
own versions of it. Yeah.
exactly. It's kind of ubiquitous, and ubiquitously kind of loathed at the same time as well by a lot of, like, no, the version of it is weird and all these things. And so I have a
There
lot of,
are a few tunes that the way they are in the Fake Book is not the way they get played in the community.
yeah, and one of the
Mm-hmm.
things about it that I find so fascinating, and I love to make this analogy with my students to kind of help, is that I usually have a prop can of soda here. Like, and I asked them, I was like, what do you call this? And some people go, oh, that's pop, or hey, that's a soda. And you realize that all throughout the country, you have, if you're in the South, it's a Coke. What kind of flavor of Coke do you want? Sprite. There you go. And it's a regional dialect. And with the fake book, what ends up happening is like, for Whiskey Before Breakfast alone, there is the way that bluegrass players will play it, how Irish players will play it, how folks from Missouri will play it versus folks in the Northeast, and then not even talking about Canadians or Scottish folks or progressive bluegrass players or so on and so forth. Basically, what ends up being is like this approximation, like this very nebulous, like, hey, I've taken all the versions and averaged them out.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's like the equivalent of, a lot of the fake books end up being the equivalent of a recipe book, where it's like, oh, this is a recipe for biscuits and gravy, but it's not your mom's recipe for biscuits and gravy. And my mom
Yeah.
always makes the best. I will fight on
Aw.
that. And so to me, I think that is one of the, a lot of the time, it's not necessarily, none of these things are sacred, in my opinion. It's about,
I agree.
yeah, about finding a multitude of perspectives, a lot of different tools for your tool chest that help you go and tackle things. So yeah, I check out Fiddler's Fake Book to kind of remind myself of, like, oh yeah, that's how the B part of June Apple goes.
Mm-hmm.
But I use it just enough to go, oh yes, that's the preheat the oven for at 450 and put it in for 2 hours. I use it just enough for that, and um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Would you say that a lot there? Is the dulcimer community a little bit more open to embracing that type of education, or is it still pretty like, you should be learning off the records?
Well, it's really interesting because just the total number of resources that exist are fewer,
Yeah, that's true.
right? So I often encourage my students, like, go listen to recordings of the song, but then I have to specify and listen to different instruments play it because they will go look for a dulcimer player playing it. And they really are only going to find probably two or maybe three, if it's a really common tune, videos where a dulcimer player is playing the tune or recordings of that because there just aren't that many.
Hmm.
But if you take a tune like Cripple Creek and you look for all of the versions you can find of it with every instrument, you're going to find hundreds. And so, in a way that doesn't always happen if you're like a fiddle player learning to play fiddle tunes,
Yeah.
dulcimer players have to look outside of their own instrument to find some of the resources. And that's where it gets tricky because there's this like really interesting thing where the dulcimer is this easy instrument because it's diatonic and it's tuned to an open tuning. And when you strum it by itself, it sounds good. And if you just put your finger on any fret, it still sounds good. Like all of that is true. And also, how do you go learn a tune that there isn't already existing mountain dulcimer resources for? Well,
Yeah.
now you have to understand some music theory. You have to know how to read standard notation. You have to understand what key your dulcimer is tuned to and how to make it apply to whatever key the tune is in, and decide if you're going to learn the tune in its original key, if you're going to learn the tune in a more dulcimer friendly key, if you're going to like tune to a different tuning to be able to play it in this other key, or if you're going to have to
Yeah.
like fudge some of the notes. And it gets very quickly way more complicated than a fiddle, which is this really hard instrument to start playing. It's so hard to make the first good sound on a fiddle, like ages before the pulling the bow across the strings sounds musical and not like crunching, you know? Like, so the
Exactly.
first sounds on a fiddle are hard, so hard. But if you want to learn how to play a fiddle tune from a fiddle player, there's
It's right there.
10,000 resources for that. So the entry point on dulcimer is easy, and then the learning curve goes steeply up to be able to like find things. And so what can happen sometimes is that there is only one person who has written tab for this one song. So now that is the gospel because it's the
Yeah.
and you can very quickly come back around to finding the like there is a way of playing this mentality. So I don't think we escape it. um
Completely.
yeah,
Yeah. It's
yeah,
very interesting. It's like um finding the almost like oh the new gospels of a brand new religion versus the old million translated versions.
uh-huh, uh-huh,
That's
yeah,
very interesting. Well,
yeah,
I I think it's very fascinating to kind of do like looking at the research of it. One of the projects that I would love to do one day once I kind of figure out my workflows and how to be better at this type of teach this type of teaching style. I would love to teach a course on um, music notation systems,
mm,
and not necessarily like, oh, we're going to make everyone be fluent in this, but seeing the logic behind music notation systems and see everything and covering everything from like, oh, just chord and lyric sheets up through ABC notation, through um, you know, Nashville number systems, to all these different things to kind of develop. Because I think getting the ability to see how other people think, that level of music cognition, and the ways that we've created systems.
yeah.
Um,
And like
in
things like how do we notate embellishments?
hmm
You know, I a few years ago I got real granular about describing the different articulations that come from slides.
yeah,
And I realized that there's at least four different ways we use slides on the mountain dulcimer, like four
hmm
different sounds we make from slides, and they're all notated. Squiggly, like a line across and the letter S above it. Like that's it.
yeah,
And it's describing at least four different things with
that's
one shorthand. And so then, there's a part of my brain that wants to get like more specific? How do we write this more accurately? How do we more accurately represent what we're trying to communicate when we put it on the paper? And then there's this other part of me that's like, we can never, we can never fully accurately represent all the things. I've been kind of going down a rabbit hole of studying Scottish music, and I think about how hornpipes get written down, and like,
Yeah.
if you know that the word hornpipe means dakka dakka da da dakka 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 da, then when you see straight eights in the music, you don't play them as straight eights, you play them as dotted eighth and 16th note sets because that's how you play a hornpipe. But if you picked up a, a tune book and you didn't already have that piece of information and you just see even eighth notes, you just play them as even eighth notes,
I had a
right?
problem. Oh yeah, I had
And
a
like
thing.
I learned about 6/8 marches. That's a thing in Scotland. It's not just
Interesting.
jigs that can be in 6/8 time, it's marches. So if you look up the tune The Atholl Highlanders, which made it into the
Yeah,
Portland collection, so it's become part of American music culture vernacular, every American who plays it as a jig. But if you
yeah.
go look up Scottish pipe bands playing it, it sounds completely different because if you play it as a march, which is what it was originally written as,
Yeah.
it sounds so different because a Scottish traditional musician looking at this would be like, oh, this is a 6/8 march. And they would play it as a march and they would know what that means. You put it in the Portland collection, it's going to come out as jig every time.
Every t- I love that description because you're exactly right. I think it's I, one of the things I describe to a lot of students who come to me from a more classical music tradition is that they're so used to the idea that the music is gospel and that all of the tools created within sheet music um, are the right tools for the job. And what's really weird is that, like, if you look at old time bowings and everything, and how they create pulses and they create everything, if you, there's not all of a sudden all of the tricks that we're used to in notation world for classical violin don't really fit. And so like when you see try the closest approximations to transcription for it's a mess. It's gosh darn ineligible. Not
Right.
illegible. There we go. Oops. And I don't know, like for me, I think the system that a lot of performance practice Baroque musicians are doing right now and would almost end up being the best system because like in Baroque music it was a lot more understood that you were going to improvise, that the first time through you kind of play what the composer had intended, and then the second time through you were expected to really embellish and do that type of embellishment, and you wouldn't necessarily see it written onto the page. There was just kind of an implied these are the things that you're going to do.
Interesting. It makes me really think again about how much improvisational musicians study Bach.
Yeah.
And it seems like such a juxtaposition between Baroque era classical music and contemporary improvisation and jazz. But if you have an understanding that Baroque music was also a lot about improvisation, then
Yep.
it's like, oh, that's not a big leap anymore, you know?
Well, and one of the things that's really fascinating is like a lot of the so many ornamentations that how do I put it? What ends up being really interesting is that like with a Baroque bow, you going and playing a lot of it almost feels way more natural to play traditional Irish like music on with a Baroque bow versus a classical, and then you look at a lot of the history, and it's like, oh no, like all of these fiddles were making their way up through Italy, up to the north, and then they were being bought by rich entrepreneurs and businessmen in Scotland. And they're like, we should be making these up here, but we don't have the wood, so we're going to make them with tin. And then all of a sudden, like, the popularity of the fiddle exploded in that whole area, being made with tin fiddles that you could take onto boats and out and all these things. And so, like, so much of the history of the violin was actually kind of like hand in hand with the technology of the age. And so, like, oh wow, a lot of this, it's it stems from a very similar place, which I think is fascinating,
It's
and
so fascinating.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm excited to continue to dive deep into this and look at some of the books that continue to look at some of the books that have really impacted my um overall teaching. That so I'm going to do the inverse of that question now. Hey, is there a book that you really have that has really impacted you as a musician, music teacher, so on and so forth, that you would say is probably not very well known in your communities, but you think should be? If you could offer a read this, eh.
Well, one of the ones that I come back to a lot and like was hugely formative in my musical development and now I use a lot as a tool for teaching the basics is the We Sing books. Did you
Okay.
ever have the We Sing books?
No.
It's spelled WEE, so it's like a wee little person singing.
Adorable.
And there's we sing silly songs, we sing campfire songs, we sing Bible songs, we sing and there's this whole like a collection of these we sing books. There's like nursery rhymes and there's like a dancing one that's got like play party games and finger play movement things like the
Yeah.
itsy bitsy spider and tells you like simple directions about how to do it the games or the
Interesting.
movements that go with them, but they were really really simple lead sheets with chords above them in keys that kids can sing, and there were all these just like really fun songs. And that's how I learned to read lead sheets. And like on the piano, that's how I learned to play right hand plays the melody, left hand plays the chords.
Okay.
And then when I started like learning how to read music on the dulcimer, they were such simple melodies that I used that. And I started with like, can I play any of these songs that are already written in the key of D? And then can I follow the notes that are on them in another key? And then can I learn how to transpose? And I worked out most of my understanding of how to practically, functionally read music in a way that gave me the information I needed on my instrument from the We Sing books. And they were published, I think they were all published originally in the 90s, and then they were out of print. And now they're all back again, and some of them have digital copies available. So I'm like super delighted about We Sing books.
That is so that is so cool. And I love that I bet it would absolutely tickle the author and editor and everyone that just like, oh, this drastically improved my education as a kid, and now I do this for a living and live.
Right, like it wasn't the one that explained how to do it. I had like the music theory books that explained how to do it, but the music theory books that explained how to do it didn't give me anything practical to practice it with. And so I found that the We Sing books were like the playground for practicing all the theory that I was learning. And they would be like usually the keys of C, F, G, and D were the most
Mm-hmm.
common keys for those tunes. So they're like using different key signatures. I had to understand key and key signature and sharps and flats, but I didn't have to do it like in the key of B or the key of C sharp minor or, the ones that are way harder to decipher at the beginning. They were all keys that are kind of accessible.
Yeah. That's so,
Yeah.
and it's amazing like that you bring that up because as like it's really funny as a fiddle and like when I'm teaching fiddle and mandolin students, it's really easy and I therefore kind of feel necessary to be able to teach like typically within the first 3 or 4 weeks of a brand new student we're able to play from C up to the key of B, so we have all of those actually from B flat to B, so we can get a pretty good suite of keys, and that helps usually can play Cripple Creek and all the keys and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, this really helps with the understanding of the fretboard and seeing how everything
Mhm.
works and the shapes and all that kind of stuff. But the shapes are so practical and useful, and we can plug them around, we can move them really easily. Banjo, not so much. Like it's like we go weeks, months down the line before we really start having to visualize the fretboard kind of like that.
Mhm.
But a lot of those what's really interesting is those banjo and guitar students end up knowing the insides of rhythm a lot more right off the bat. You know, they're like,
Yeah.
oh, they can tend to be one and two and three and four and one. Like they really understand the
Yeah.
because that is much more needed early on and more accessible.
Uh-huh.
And
I've been working really hard on breaking down rhythms in different ways recently and like
yeah.
trying to get more to the bottom of how to teach rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And it is another one of those topics that at the beginning it seems simple because it's just like one and two and three and four and then as you just keep delving into it, it's like, wow, none of this is simple. There's
It
so much nuance. There's so much complexity in this thing that seems simple. It's not simple. None of this is simple.
yeah, and then there's all of the different systems of like, okay, do you do the one and two and three, or do you do ta ti ti,
Right?
like go the old Kodai method, or are you going to be really hip and modern and start being like the tonal s- uh, rhythmic solfege of folks from India and so
I haven't
so.
gone down that rabbit hole yet, but I really want
Oh
to.
my gosh, if I could take an
It's
online
really calling out to me, and I'm like, slow down just a little bit. You have other things you need to figure out first in your musical life, but I'm
if you
gonna have to
if we
start
find an
studying.
online teacher that teaches a course, we are taking it together. I'm putting my foot down. We're doing it because I want to learn that so bad.
Uh-huh.
But one of my favorite little books that is I different. And I sorry, book. I'll get you in a minute. Um, is Best Practice by Judy Minot.
I don't
Um,
know this book.
it's a very interesting book. Um, Best Practice: Inspiration and Ideas for Traditional Musicians. And so we use the term folk music educator, but I honestly think we probably could have also used the term um, trad music educator. That's another
Hmm.
encompassing term for that idea. But when I got this book, I kind of knew the size and everything. I was expecting something to be 8 to 9 chapters, each chapter being 10 to 15, 20 pages kind of idea, talking about different practices and the traditional forms of, hey, here's a little bit of a narrative, here's the premise, here's all of these examples of why the premise is correct with bibliography and all that stuff. But in reality, what this is about 200 chapters, each being about a page to half page long. And what ends up being really interesting is that it is the I think the design of this book is, hey, start your practice by reading one of these little excerpts and think about the concept that they're bringing up, like your relationship between your ring finger and your pinky, how like you can't really lift up that ring finger as much, and so you
Right.
kind of need to
Ring finger
support
does not want to be independent.
be independent, how you support that a little bit. And then it gives you like a little affirmational message of like, hey, today I will work on increasing in strength and independence in my ring and pinky fingers. And so these are a lot of really interesting little thought provoking things. And so what ends up being what I like about it is it tends, even though I got to take a lot of music education when I was growing up and working at a collegiate level and all these things, one of the things that ended up being really hard is I never felt like I had the lexicon or the vocabulary to truly kind of describe the the issues that I was having musically and being able to
Mhm.
put it conceptually. You know, we spent a lot of time thinking about like how to think musically in these more abstract spaces. And this has really helped me with my students create like just daily, everyday language of describing what's going on in your little noggin as you're
Yeah.
practicing, and how that can really be impactful and not demystify in a like a bad way. You know, you're not pulling the you're not looking at Oz behind the curtain and realizing how sad it is, but you're inviting the complicated thing to the table so you can understand it better in your own daily language. And I think it one of my favorite little books, and for a lot of times if students and I are just like not exactly what to do, I will get out this book and we'll read through a couple of these things out loud and hit something until it starts to sound really resonate, and then we can kind of start chatting about it and find different ways of practicing it. And it ends up being a lot more of a, oh, that resonates with me in my life right now and gives me ideas to create my own little practical practice things.
Yeah, it's so hard because so much of music creation is abstract and is outside of language.
Yeah.
Necessarily so. And then so much of what we try to do with music theory and music education is wrap language around this thing for which there is no language.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say the language is going to be imperfect. It's never going to fully capture what's happening because the thing that's happening is outside of language. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like its own language, but it's outside of our word language lexicon, right?
Yeah.
And we can practice putting into words the things that we're doing and experiencing and get better at it too and become better communicators. And there are all these different languages inside of the music community. Like you were talking about the different kinds of standard notation. One of the classes I took in college was a live audio class. And one of the things we had to do was name the hertz of different pitches
Yeah.
because the sound man's soundboard doesn't say that's an A note that's ringing right now. It says it's this hertz. But as the musician on the stage, if you can communicate this range is too high right now and it's ringing, and you can use hertz to describe that, now you can speak the same language with them. And it was like this really crazy tool for ear training that actually really helped me understand like the sounds my instrument makes by doing these ear training exercises in what is the hertz of this pitch.
100%. Like I love your example is so perfect for the concept. And for me, one of the things, like, if as we're getting starting to wrap up and nice
Right.
wrapping this up a nice little bow, I think that is one thing that I would say is one of the reasons that I do embrace written down education books, and I hope to see more of them. And I hope that you and I finally get off our tookuses and start writing our own, for even if they're just for our students.
Yeah.
And why I think everyone should go ahead and do this, because um, we're music theory is purely just trying to give vocabulary to the things that we're hearing.
Mhm.
And same with ear training, same with all of these books. And we're just trying to create systems that will better help us effectively communicate with each other. To me, that was the definition of literacy that I was given by one of my favorite teachers. Is they go, it is not the ability to read and write, it is the ability to effectively communicate within a culture. And I think that's kind of our should be our goal. And I feel like so we have we live in a world where we're still trying to figure out the medium of YouTube videos and TikToks and Instagram and posts and blogs and so on and so forth. We're still trying to figure out that medium of the best way of communicating.
Right.
But we have been doing this for the better part of 5 centuries at this point.
Right.
And we're
Books still
really
have some value, I think, in a
we're
really big
ironing
way.
out a lot of the things.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but I hope this has been fun and educational for everyone. I always have fun making podcasts with you, my friend.
Me
And
too. And I'm excited
yes,
to go find that book.
I hope that you enjoy it. It's going to be super good. If we maybe we'll get our ducks in a row enough to make like little links to here, go check this out, maybe.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll work on that.
we'll work on that. That does sound like a really great thing that the fictional versions of ourselves might be able to do someday.
Uh-huh. And as I like to say, the optimistic Erin is like, yes, we'll provide links to this in the show notes that will someday exist.
That will someday exist. But hey, we didn't miss a week. That's what we have yet to miss a week in 2024. Knock on wood.
That's
But
right.
yeah. Friends, thank you so much for listening to the Folk Music Educator podcast. We really do appreciate and value you. And you can find us wherever you're listening to a podcast now or on YouTube. And you can also, if you just want to say hi to us on the interwebs, you can find me at Fiddle and Phil on Instagram and TikTok, and Fiddle and Phil Kramer for my website, and Erin May Music on all.
Erin May Music. Yep.
And so, thank you so much. And I think today more than ever, that idea of always a teacher and always a student. So, thank you
Definitely
so much for
applies.
listening, and we're excited to see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.